Hi class, this lecture will go over some of the introduction information about lactation in livestock. The reference for this chapter is Dameron, chapter 12. Overall, our learning objectives are to identify some of the anatomy of the mammary gland, describe lactation and components of milk, and look at lactation curves. We're also going to briefly introduce the concept of using BST, or bovine somatotropin, to increase milk production. As an introduction, lactation is simply the production of milk, and this is thought of as being distinctly a mammalian trait, i.e. why they're called mammals. The primary sources of milk consumed by humans come from goats, sheep, water buffaloes, and cows. However, there are some other species that can be used for milk production, and these include camels, llamas, and yak. In the prenatal period, the basic structures of the mammary gland will develop. But at puberty, and then with each subsequent estrous cycle, the sex hormones progesterone and estradiol, as we talked about in our previous lectures, these here will stimulate the growth of the mammary gland at a rate that's more rapid than the rest of the body. Basically, progesterone and estradiol will quickly cause the mammary gland to grow. Now, there are some definitions associated with lactation. The first one I'm going to introduce is mammogenesis, which is simply the development of the mammary gland. This becomes complete at puberty, but it will not function to its maximum capacity until pregnancy and subsequently lactogenesis occurs. Lactogenesis is the initiation of milk secretion or the induction of lactation. Another term we can refer to as galactopoiesis is just the maintenance or enhancement of established lactation. Two more concepts. First, we have stage 1 lactogenesis. This is when immunoglobulin uptake occurs and the colostrum is formed. A lot of this will happen prior to parturition because remember that colostrum is the very first milk that the neonate will consume. Stage 2 lactogenesis is when the larger amounts of milk secretion will begin, and then the colostrum production will shut down, and then it's more milk of a normal composition. If we want to look at those definitions related to a timeline associated with pregnancy and lactation overall, if we look on the left, we can see here we're just referring to a period when the animal, after it reaches puberty, it becomes cyclic, goes through estrous cycles. Once an effective mating and fertilization occurs, the dark line we can refer to as conception. From conception to parturition, there's fetal development, when this is the timing of pregnancy in a dam. During the fetal development and pregnancy, mammogenesis will occur. During parturition, remember, is the action of actually giving birth, lactogenesis occurs. And finally, after parturition, during the neonatal development, this is a time, the major period of lactation, and when galactopoiesis, or the maintenance of milk production, occurs. As we move on to talk about the anatomy of the mammary gland, from bottom to top, at the bottom we see something called the teat meatus. Which is right here. Next, we have the teat cistern. Followed by what we refer to just as the gland cistern. These just kind of will actually hold milk for it to be let down and consumed. Next, all of these little branch points are referred to as just the ducts. but the major ones just down the middle are referred to as major ducts. At the end of all of these ducts, we have what we refer to as lobes, and on these lobes contain what we refer to as lobules, and these lobules contain alveoli. If we want to look more closely at the gland, we are looking here at the lobules. Surrounding the outside of the outer layers of the lobules are the alveolar cells. Around those are myoepithelial cells. So these are just muscle cells. And what you can think of this is, as these are a bunch of layers. So there's a layer of alveolar cells, and then a layer of muscle cells, then a layer of capillaries, which is the venous or the blood supply. And then also feeding the mammary gland, we have the venous supply and drainage, so the venule and the arteriole. As we continue to look more at the anatomy of a mammary gland, here on the right, you can see kind of what we just showed, with the alveolar cells lining the inside, which is up next to the lumen. The lumen is the inside of if you think of it as a bubble. Following that, there's the muscular cells, the myoepithelial cells, and then not shown here is all of the capillaries. Now again, the primary structure of the mammary gland is the alveoli, and it actually does produce milk. Alveoli are also able to store milk. The milk is produced by these specialized secretory cells that have three major functions. First function is the absorbed precursor from the bloodstream. So this means that they are able to pull out the necessary nutrients to put into the milk. The second function is to transform these nutrients into lactate, fat, and protein that will go into the milk. And third, they must transfer this newly synthesized milk into the lumen of the alveolus. So pulling these nutrients, synthesizing it all together into the milk, and then transferring it into the lumen, or the inside of the bubble. We could kind of think of it as a little water balloon if you want to get creative. Now, lactation is strongly controlled by the endocrine system. Again, the endocrine system, we have looked at it previously, and it is responsible for regulation of various functions throughout the body. There are many hormones involved in this process, but the two major ones I want you to be familiar with are prolactin. And prolactin in this process is responsible for initiation and maintenance of milk production, and oxytocin. Oxytocin is solely associated with the milk letdown and secretion. There's one more hormone. We've mentioned it previously in class, but I want to mention its role as it's related to lactation. Progesterone is a hormone that actually is inhibitory to prolactin. So prolactin is good for initiating and maintaining milk production. Progesterone does the opposite. Now this chart just shows the different patterns of some of the hormones related to parturition. So time point 0 here in the middle, this is parturition. Prior to parturition, you'll see progesterone, which is the hormone of pregnancy, will decline. So you see it declining rather sharply in this chart. But the ones I just spoke about is one here, prolactin, which is responsible for the initiation and maintenance of milk production. You can see just before parturition, It's going to rise very dramatically. The other one that we spoke about is oxytocin. And also, just before parturition, you'll see oxytocin rising quite dramatically as well. Oxytocin is a major hormone involved in this process that we refer to as the milk letdown reflex. Now, this is just a normal cow coming in to be milked, and it can be either milked by a commercial milking operation, or it could be milked by its calf or neonate out in the field. But in the milk letdown reflex, stimulation will occur to the teats. When the stimulation occurs, the nervous system will receive some signals that will travel all the way to the brain. And the brain, these signals are going to be received by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will then synthesize and release oxytocin via the posterior pituitary. So oxytocin is released from the posterior pituitary. It goes down through the animal's heart and is pumped to the rest of the body, where once it goes to the systemic circulation and travels to the teats, it signals the teat or the mammary gland to let down milk. Now this chart is just associated with showing the concentrations of serum oxytocin during milking in cows, and this is associated with what we just discussed as the milk letdown reflex. The x-axis is the time relative to milking in minutes. So let's write that. So we have -60, which is an hour before, -10, -5, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, and then 60 again. On the y-axis, we have serum oxytocin, which is measuring oxytocin in the blood. This is in our units, micro units per mil, and we have 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. Now, one important distinction to show is that oxytocin is very low prior to milking. In this experiment, right around this time, they came in and stimulated the teat just before milking, which occurred at time point 0. After stimulation, up until milking, the oxytocin was released from the hypothalamus via the posterior pituitary and spiked in the blood. So, just prior to milking, oxytocin levels were relatively low. Once stimulation occurred at the start of milking, the oxytocin increased dramatically, and at the start of milking, it continued to increase till about 3 minutes, into the milking process, and then it started to drop again dramatically after that. By an hour after milking, oxytocin levels were reduced to the levels just that are similar to those seen prior to stimulation. And this shows that oxytocin is, and this is just showing us that oxytocin is a major hormone involved in this process of milk letdown. Next, we're going to look at the components of milk. Components of milk are pretty basic in terms of nutrients that we talk about overall in class. There are carbohydrates, where the major one is lactose. The carbohydrates are only produced by the secretory cells in the mammary gland, and lactose, if you want to think about it, is made up of glucose and galactose, or two other sugars. Now, protein is a major component of milk, and the primary protein is casein, which is more than 80% of the total protein found in milk. Now, the mammary gland is the only tissue that is capable of making this protein. There are other serum proteins found, including lactoglobulin, lactoalbumin, and immunoglobulins. Next, there are many lipids found in the blood, but it can vary tremendously based on the feed, the stage of lactation, as well as many other factors. Most of the milk is made up of triglycerides, greater than 90% of that. Finally, calcium is very high in milk. And it is not uncommon for blood calcium levels in high-producing cows to fall when high levels of protein are being produced for the milk. Now, colostrum, remember, is that it is the first milk produced by mammals to be consumed by the neonates. It's high in proteins because a lot of these proteins are in the form of immunoglobulins, which are antibodies. The neonates will then depend on this passive form of immunity to help them get through just after birth until they are able to form some of their own immunoglobulins. This chart on the right just shows the differences between colostrum and mature milk. See, colostrum has a relatively higher gross energy, but a very, very, very high of immunoglobulin G compared to mature milk. Another one that is much greater in colostrum is insulin, prolactin, and IGF-1, TGF-alpha, and of course cortisol and 17-beta-estradiol. And these are all important to be transferred to the neonate just after birth to help with development of their immune system and to take part in the passive form of immunity. Now, this figure shows just a typical lactation curve. On the x-axis, we can see the weeks of production, which is referring to weeks of milk production. And on the y-axis is just a relative units of milk. Just after parturition, time point 0, you can see the milk production will rise dramatically until it will peak at about 6 to 8 weeks post-parturition. Then it will steadily decline for the next, 200, 300 days, depending on how long the cow is lactating. Now, lactation has three main stages. There's early lactation, which is in the 14 to 100 days. Mid-lactation spans 100 to 200 days, and then late lactation is 200 days to the end. Now, bovine somatotropin, BST, is also known as growth hormone and is common to be used within the industry to help increase milk production. BST is a naturally occurring hormone involved in the production of milk. However, producers sometimes will come in and give it exogenous BST, and they can do this to increase milk production by 10 to 20%. So for a farmer, this relates to money or profitability. And the reason they see this as beneficial is because the efficiency of milk production will improve because the cost of maintaining the cow is less as a percentage of its total requirements. Now, I am introducing this just to let you know that it is common within the industry. However, it does tend to be quite controversial because they are given exogenous growth hormones, and people are sometimes concerned about what this means or how it relates to the milk being consumed. However, that's not a topic that we are going to get into in this course. So in summary, milk production is a complicated process that requires coordination among various processes within the body. The major hormones are prolactin and oxytocin. Remember, prolactin is associated with initiation and maintenance, whereas oxytocin is associated with milk letdown. Colostrum is the first milk, and it contains immunoglobulins for passive immunity. And milk's major components include carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and calcium. All right, that's all that I have for you for this lecture.